In the autumn of 1988, a new kind of story flickered across America's television screens. It wasn't just another sitcom, it was a reflection, a stark, honest mirror held up to the heart of working-class life. Unfiltered, unapologetically real. And at its very center stood John Goodman, the quintessential blue-collar patriarch, a man America felt it already knew. For nearly a decade, his presence was inseparable from Roseanne Barr's, a constant force on screen and off, navigating the laughter, the chaos, and the cultural revolution they ignited together. But beneath the surface of the applause, behind the staggering, record-breaking ratings, a different story was being written in the shadows, one of mounting tension and a brewing betrayal. It would all come down to a single, shattering decision that would burn the bridge to their shared past. And now, John Goodman is finally breaking his silence on what truly brought it all to an end, and why he carries the certainty that some things can never be rebuilt. This is the rise of an unlikely hero, long before the world ever called him Dan Connor. The story begins in the quiet suburbs of Afton, Missouri, with a boy whose world was shaped by the silent echoes of loss and the ever-present ache of trying to belong. He was born on June 20th, 1952. He had only seen 2 summers when tragedy cast its long shadow over his life. His father, Leslie Goodman, was stolen by a sudden, fatal heart attack, leaving a young wife, Virginia, to face the world alone with 3 small children. Virginia became a portrait of quiet resilience, working tirelessly as a waitress, a saleswoman, often juggling 2 jobs just to keep the fragile vessel of their family from sinking. But some wounds are not so easily mended. The absence of his father, John would later admit, carved a void in his life, a hollow space that no amount of time could ever truly fill. "I grew up afraid of everything," he once confessed in a quiet moment, afraid of being alone, afraid of not being good enough. The schoolyard offered little refuge. His size, which would one day become a signature, then made him a target. Adrift and struggling to find his place, he found solace not in the company of others, but in the ink and paper worlds of comic books, the pantheon of heroes from DC and Marvel. These characters became his silent mentors. He saw in Green Lantern a model of courage, in the Atom a vision of intellect, in Captain America the very soul of loyalty. And from these pages, he learned a fundamental truth: that true strength wasn't about the fight, but about the profound, quiet act of getting back on your feet. In the real world, the Boy Scouts offered a similar kind of sanctuary, a place of order and purpose where he could finally thrive. It was there, in the discipline and camaraderie, that he began to forge the very qualities, leadership, teamwork, resilience, that would one day define his path. By high school, the very thing that had once made him an outcast became his greatest asset. On the football field, he was a force of nature, a powerhouse lineman, all raw talent and unyielding determination. His prowess on the gridiron earned him more than just respect. It earned him a scholarship to Southwest Missouri State University, what we now call Missouri State. For a boy from a small town who had always felt invisible, it was a ticket to a new life. But destiny, as he would learn, is a fragile thing. Then, in 1970, during his first year, a single, brutal moment on the field, a torn ACL. The dream was over, before it had even begun. The loss was more than just physical. Without the game, he was adrift once more, stripped of his direction, his plan, his very identity. And then, as if guided by fate, he found himself at the door of the university's drama department, persuaded by a friend to audition for a play. The part was small, just a handful of lines. But as he stepped into the stage lights that night, something profound shifted within him. The energy of the crowd, the sound of their laughter, the strange alchemy of becoming someone else. It filled a void he hadn't realized was still there, a sense of purpose he hadn't known since before his father was gone. "I was smitten," Goodman would later recall. "In that moment, I knew I had found what I was meant to do for the rest of my life." At Missouri State, he wasn't alone. He honed his craft alongside a new generation of talent, studying with future luminaries like Kathleen Turner and Tess Harper. In this world of scripts and stages, John Goodman finally found more than a craft. He found a tribe, a place where he finally, truly belonged. Upon graduating in 1975, he made the kind of wager that defines a life. With just $1,000 borrowed from his brother, he boarded a bus bound for New York City, chasing a dream into the heart of the unknown. A mother's fear clung to him, a premonition of violence or starvation on the city's unforgiving streets. She was terrified, he would later recall. But inside John Goodman, a different feeling was taking root, a quiet defiance. The New York of the mid-1970s was a city of shadows and promise, a concrete jungle both dangerous and electric with a raw, artistic pulse. He found his place within it, a modest apartment in the aptly named Hell's Kitchen. It was a neighborhood that mirrored the man unpolished, with its own story of survival etched into every corner. And the years that followed were a crucible, an endless cycle of auditions and the stinging echo of rejection. Survival meant disappearing into the city's anonymous labor, long nights spent waiting tables, selling tickets, taking any job that would keep the dream from flickering out. There was even one chaotic night spent as a bouncer, a brief, jarring encounter with the city's harder side that taught him he wasn't built for that kind of fight. But the fight within him, that he refused to lose. His salvation wouldn't be found under the Klieg lights of Hollywood, but in the hushed intimacy of the theater. Goodman poured his soul onto the stage, embracing the world of off-Broadway productions. He worked the circuits of dinner theaters and small-town playhouses across the nation. There was no glamour in it, only the honest sweat of the craft, and with every performance, something was being built. Every character, no matter how fleeting, became a lesson, a sharpening of his instincts, a deeper excavation into the soul of ordinary life. By the dawn of the 1980s, a quiet transformation had occurred. The young man who felt like an outsider was now a cornerstone, one of the most dependable actors in the New York theater scene. He couldn't have known it then, but every memorized line, every grueling rehearsal, every door slammed shut, was quietly forging the very man needed for a role that would not just change his life, but define a generation. The role of a working-class husband named Dan Connor, the genesis of an icon. By 1987, John Goodman had logged more than a decade in the trenches of the industry, a craftsman laboring in relative obscurity. His resume was a map of persistence, off-Broadway stages, regional theaters, and a scattering of small film roles that did more for his craft than for his wallet. He was not yet a star, but he possessed a currency that Hollywood, in its heart of hearts, desperately craved: authenticity. It was in his warmth, a genuine gravity that pulled you in. It was in his impeccable timing, his rare gift for illuminating the extraordinary within the ordinary. This quality made him an anomaly, and it was precisely what the executives at ABC were searching for, as they began the daunting task of casting a new sitcom, a show built around the formidable truth-telling voice of a comedian named Roseanne Barr. The premise of Roseanne was, on its surface, simple, but in the television landscape of the time, it was an act of revolution. This wasn't a fantasy of sprawling mansions and flawless families. It was a mirror held up to the lives of real people, grappling with real struggles. It was a world of arguments and affection, of laughter earned through the grind of everyday existence. It was messy, it was raw, and it was profoundly American. The producers had their Roseanne, the unwavering center of this new universe. But a crucial piece was missing. They were searching for her other half, a believable, blue-collar husband with a soul. Dozens of actors read for the part, but the alchemy wasn't there. And then, John Goodman walked through the door. He was in Los Angeles performing Antony and Cleopatra, a world away from the Connors' living room. The network called him in for the audition. The moment he and Roseanne stood in the same room, something shifted. The chemistry wasn't just present, it was electric, an undeniable force. She was a storm of sarcasm and unvarnished truth. He was the calm center, a steady presence with a quick wit, and an authenticity that couldn't be faked during their test scene. Goodman inhabited the character so completely, so effortlessly, that when he delivered a line, Roseanne, without breaking character, instinctively barked back, "Shut up." Goodman didn't flinch. He laughed, volleyed a remark right back, and the tension in the room shattered into laughter. As producer Marcy Carsey would recall, in less than 30 seconds, everyone in that room knew they had found Dan Connor. When Roseanne premiered on the night of October 18, 1988, it wasn't just a debut, it was a cultural detonation. The series didn't merely find an audience, it seized the nation's attention. In a matter of weeks, it ascended to the summit of the Nielsen ratings. And by the close of its inaugural season, it stood as the second most watched program in the entire country, commanding an average of over 36 million viewers each week. Viewers looked at the Connors, and for the first time, they saw themselves reflected on screen: the mountain of bills, the chaos of raising children, the arguments born of love and exhaustion. And at the center of that reflection was John Goodman's Dan. He was the anchor, not a flawless patriarch, but a real one, patient in one breath, impossibly stubborn in the next, but his every action was rooted in a deep, unwavering love. Behind the curtain of the stage, the dynamic between Goodman and Roseanne was a story all its own, a reflection of their on-screen marriage, a dance of playfulness, passion, and at times, pure combustion. Roseanne Barr wasn't just a comedian, she was a force of nature, but beneath the laughter was an iron will, fiercely protective of her creation. She demanded creative control, a demand that often put her on a collision course with producers and the writer's room. In the show's infancy, A battle for its very soul erupted a now infamous feud with series creator Matt Williams over authorship, over the show's fundamental direction, and when Roseanne drew a line in the sand, threatening to walk away, it was Goodman, alongside Laurie Metcalf and a young George Clooney, who stood with her. Their united front forced Williams's departure, a seismic shift that marked the dawn of Roseanne's absolute reign. It was a gamble of epic proportions. On one side of the coin, Roseanne's instincts were the very thing that kept the show grounded, its humor sharp, its heart relatable. But on the other, her tightening grip began to suffocate the set, the air growing thick with tension. Tom Arnold, her then-boyfriend and later husband, began to influence decisions, and his presence fractured the once cohesive family. Yet, as others chose sides or simply walked away, Goodman remained the quiet center, the calm in an escalating storm. He remained focused, a steady hand balancing his signature humor with unshakable professionalism. And that consistency did not go unnoticed. Between 1989 and 1995, Goodman earned an astonishing 7 consecutive Emmy nominations for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Comedy Series. And though the Emmy statue remained elusive for his work on Roseanne, he took home the Golden Globe for Best Actor. In 1993, he stood on that stage, trophy in hand, and with a wry smile, quipped, "I'd like to thank my personal trainer, but I don't have one." It was that humility, that profound self-awareness, that cemented his place in the hearts of millions. Goodman's performance did more than just make Dan Connor a household name. It fundamentally re-engineered the archetype of the American television father. For decades, the small screen had given us patriarchs who were distant, perfectly coiffed, or impossibly flawless. Dan Connor was none of those things. He was real. He was tired, he was funny, he was fiercely loyal. A man whose love for his family burned brighter than his ability to articulate it. In living rooms across the nation, people saw their own fathers, their own lives, reflected in him. But as the ratings climbed into the stratosphere, the crushing weight of that fame began to take its toll. Roseanne was ascending, becoming one of the most formidable women in Hollywood, and the pressure to stay at the summit was immense, a constant, grinding force. The soundstage, once echoing with easy laughter, now felt heavy, burdened by the weight of expectation and a bone-deep exhaustion. Goodman often found himself adrift, caught between an unwavering loyalty to his co-star and a desperate need for simple peace. He would later describe the experience of working with Roseanne as being on a roller coaster with no brakes. The highs were breathtaking, but the plunges into the dark were sudden and terrifyingly unpredictable. And so, while Roseanne became a touchstone of American culture, the chaos swirling behind the curtain was a dark premonition, a storm gathering on a distant horizon. Laughter, conflict, consequence. The 1990s were meant to be the golden era of Roseanne, but beneath the glittering surface of success, a relentless turmoil churned. The lines began to blur, Roseanne Barr's personal life bleeding into the fabric of the show itself, her tumultuous marriage to Tom Arnold, and his growing shadow over production becoming a source of deep friction, a tension that rippled through the cast and crew. Many, Goodman included, could feel the very atmosphere of the set shift from a creative collaboration to a state of managed chaos. Barr's behavior grew erratic, sometimes rewriting scripts moments before cameras rolled, other times casting out trusted writers who were once part of the family. Through it all, Goodman, a man known for his deep well of patience, found himself playing the role of peacemaker. He held a profound admiration for her raw talent, yet struggled with the sheer force of her volatility. "She could be the funniest person you ever met," he would later recall, "and the most difficult person to be in a room with the very next day." By the mid-1990s, the toll was visible. Both stars were running on empty. The series that had once been their shared dream now felt like an anchor, heavy with the chains of expectation and fatigue. And yet, Goodman's loyalty never wavered. He would stand before the press and defend her, even as the critics sharpened their knives. When the final curtain fell in 1997, after 9 long seasons, the feeling was profoundly bittersweet. Goodman was proud of what they had built, proud of the legacy, proud that together they had forever altered the landscape of television. But a deeper part of him understood that the flame that was Time's Roseanne Times had finally flickered and died. So, Goodman turned his gaze toward the silver screen, determined to prove his artistry stretched far beyond the confines of sitcom laughter. And there, he found his muse in the enigmatic vision of Joel and Ethan Coen, a partnership that would forge some of cinema's most unforgettable characters, beginning with the haunting world of Time's Barton Fink asterisk, followed by the cult phenomenon of Time's The Big Lebowski asterisk, and the mythic South of Time's Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Asterisk. In every frame, he walked a razor's edge, blending raw menace with a profound, almost wounded humanity. It was a complexity, perhaps, forged in the crucible of his years opposite Roseanne Barr, a masterclass in navigating the beautiful and the damned. Yet, as his star ascended in the Hollywood firmament, his private world was collapsing into shadow. The bottle, once a companion, was becoming his master. "I was drinking at work," he would later confess, the memory a ghost in his voice. "It was embarrassing. I had to stop." The year 2007 marked a line in the sand. He walked into rehab, seeking to reclaim the man he was losing. He would credit his wife and daughter as his anchors in the storm, the ones who pulled him back from the brink. It was more than a turning point. It was a quiet, painful reckoning. A decade would pass. A decade of sobriety and quiet rebuilding. But fate, it seemed, was not finished with Dan Connor. It was preparing to draw him back into that familiar living room where a tragedy he could never have imagined was waiting in the wings. The return and the ruin. In the spring of 2018, after 21 long years, the iconic plaid couch returned to television. It was a cultural moment where pure nostalgia collided with a new, fractured American reality. An entire generation was waiting to welcome Dan and Roseanne back into their homes. The premiere was a phenomenon, drawing an astonishing 18 million viewers, a ratings titan unseen in comedy for nearly half a decade. Goodman himself described the feeling as like putting on an old pair of shoes. For a fleeting, beautiful moment, it seemed the old magic was not just remembered, but reborn. But the moment was ephemeral, destined to shatter. On May 29, 2018, a single tweet from Roseanne Barr ignited a firestorm, drawing a grotesque comparison involving Valerie Jarrett, a former senior advisor to President Obama. The digital words were a toxic brew, invoking fringe political groups and a classic sci-fi film in a way that crossed every line. The condemnation was not just immediate, it was absolute. The network, ABC, moved with surgical speed. Within hours, Channing Dungey, the president of ABC Entertainment, issued a statement, her words, a final judgment. Barr's tweet was abhorrent, repugnant, and inconsistent with our values. And with that, the show was gone. Cancelled. For John Goodman, the news was a shockwave he never saw coming. The cast and crew learned their fate not from a call, but from the cold glow of a news alert. Millions of dollars vanished into thin air. But for Goodman, the financial loss was a distant echo to the emotional devastation. He had spent decades building a legacy with this woman, only to watch her burn it all to the ground with a few careless keystrokes. In the chaotic days that followed, Goodman retreated into a fortress of silence. Cornered by paparazzi on a humid New Orleans street, he was a man adrift in the storm his friend had created. His only words, spoken softly, were, "I'd rather say nothing than cause more trouble." But silence cannot last forever, and months later, the dam of his restraint finally broke. In a candid interview with The Sunday Times asterisk, he did the unexpected. He defended her. "I know for a fact," he stated, "that she's not a racist." The words landed like a thunderclap, shocking a public that had already passed judgment. But for Goodman, this wasn't about politics. It was about a complicated, decades-long loyalty. And yet, loyalty was not enough to turn back time. The world of Times, Roseanne Times, was gone. Its end brought about not by failing ratings or a story that had run its course, but by the indelible stain of words that could never be unsaid. And then came the spin-off, and the silence. In the autumn of 2018, ABC announced a resurrection of sorts, a new show, titled simply, The Connors *. Roseanne Barr's iconic matriarch would be gone, her absence explained by a tragically modern and bleak fate, an opioid overdose. Goodman returned to the role that defined him, now a man hollowed out by loss. He was joined by the familiar faces of Laurie Metcalf, Sarah Gilbert, and the rest of the Connor clan. The industry was skeptical. Many believed the show could never survive the loss of its central gravity. But against all expectations, The Connors Times found its footing, carving out a quiet, resilient success. It would endure for 7 seasons, a run concluding in 2025. And through it all, Goodman poured what was left of his heart back into the character, playing the widowed Dan Connor with a profound, weary resilience. But behind the camera, the fiction bled into a painful reality. His bond with Roseanne Barr was a ruin, seemingly beyond any hope of repair. In later interviews, the truth of their estrangement would surface. "We haven't talked," he admitted, "for about 7 or 8 years." He revealed to Times The Hollywood Reporter *, his voice tinged with a final, somber acceptance. "I'd rather doubt if she wants to talk to me." As for Barr, her side of the story was yet to be told. In the year 2024, the chasm between them was given a final, stark confirmation. Her words to Fox News Digital were unequivocal. "No, I'm not friends with any of them. "They're all in the past," she declared, the statement hanging in the air like a verdict. "We don't talk." A final accusation was then cast toward those who remained, that the entire enterprise was undone by what she termed their own greed and foolishness. And yet, from the other side of the divide, John Goodman's voice was an echo of a different time, one filled only with warmth. "She made me laugh, and I made her laugh," he recalled, his tone heavy with nostalgia. It was a special time. That singular sentiment, a mix of deep affection and quiet regret, seemed to capture it all. The blinding brilliance and the profound tragedy of the Roseanne saga, a feeling that lingered as the Connors Times itself concluded after 7 seasons. Goodman, looking back, reflected on the weight of its legacy. "It's hard," he admitted to the public, his voice weathered by time. "I'm old and resistant to change. It went by so fast," he mused. "It feels like it started 2 weeks ago." And in that reflection, he seemed to grasp a truth that few others ever could. That Roseanne Times, was never just a television program. It was a mirror held up to the soul of a country, a moment in time when a generation saw their own lives, their own families, in the Connors. And though the public narrative ended in a firestorm of scandal, the deeper truth was something far simpler, and perhaps far more tragic. It ended because people, inevitably, change. It ended because the blinding light of fame can fracture the strongest of bonds, and because some things, once broken, can never be fully repaired. In the quiet aftermath, John Goodman never cast a final stone of blame at Roseanne, not entirely. What he did was mourn what was lost in the wreckage, the sound of laughter, the foundation of trust, and something that, for a fleeting moment in time, had truly felt like family. It leaves a lingering question. Could that world ever truly return? Or is its legacy, for all time, sealed by the shadow of controversy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated, don't forget to like it, share this history, and subscribe